Hey everybody, welcome back to the Trust Your Gut series with Partners in Promise. I'm Jen Barnhill, the COO, and today we have Laura Ross Stephenson joining us. She is a military parent. She is an educator I look at her resume and she has a master's of education. She has been all over living in Texas, Tennessee, Virginia, Georgia, teaching all over the country, which is such a valuable resource for our families because we've moved all over the country. The other area that she's going to talk about today is a little bit about dyslexia, but I could not do you justice. Laura, can you please do a little bit of an intro, your connection to the military, as well as kind of what we're talking about today?
Sure, absolutely. So, hi, good morning. Um, I'm Laura. I hate to stop you, but it's Stephenson. I
Oh,
know
I'm
that sounds
sorry.
weird. Nope,
Nope,
you're fine.
there we go.
You're fine. Yeah, blame it on the in-laws. Um, so I'm, devoted Army wife. We got married in '99 and began our Army adventure. My husband, we are still active duty. My husband is currently stationed in Afghanistan. We have three fantastic kids, 16, 14, and 10. My career in education began in 2000. So I'm, not to age myself, but there we are. So it spans, gosh, I'm at 6 states, 9 licenses that kind of, expire, renew, expire. So I have kind of I guess, a broad picture when it comes to education. So I began in early childhood. Teaching pre-K kindergarten, was in early childhood for many years, went back to graduate school to pursue a master's in reading education, became a licensed reading specialist and served as a reading specialist in Texas for 5 years. Then went back to the classroom in Virginia at our last PCS to teach fifth grade. And now we are back in Texas. So, and yeah, so right now I'm decided to step away from the classroom for a year with a deployed husband and three children. So currently I volunteer tutoring services here on Fort Sam, where we're stationed, just to local parents that are looking for some additional dyslexia support. So
Well, thank you for joining us. And
absolutely.
just to put some context around, what's happening right now, and while we're recording this in Texas, it's wacky weather. I would say wacky
That's an
weather Wednesday,
understatement.
but it's wacky weather Tuesday today.
Yeah.
You have some snow in the backyard.
We do. We have a lot of snow. So like I was saying earlier, if you see the lights kind of flicker and dim, it's, the rolling power outages have begun. So right now we're toasty and warm, but if you see a teenager walk back and forth, this is the warmest part of the house. So there you go.
We're military, yeah, families. We roll with every punch
Absolutely.
we get. So, one of the reasons that we're doing this series in the Trust Your Gut series is to kind of give parents a toolkit to know
Sure.
as we move around. We know our children. We're well versed in who they are, but we are not necessarily educators or specialists in
Absolutely.
different areas. So we really would love to know from your point of view, what are some things as far as reading, especially,
Hmm.
and specifically dyslexia, that are some early indicators that we can kind of separate out? Just, this is my first child, I don't know what the hitting the benchmarks are, especially as you move from state to state and district to district.
Right. Absolutely. So I always start off, anytime I do like a staff development or a parent class, it's parents don't know what they don't know. And when you Google the word dyslexia, you are overwhelmed with just this tsunami of information. And it's, how do you disaggregate and discern what is scientifically based reading research? What exactly am I reading? So my first year, so it's, where do you even begin to have that conversation? Where do you even start? So your first resource is IDA.org, the International Dyslexia Association. That is where you will see scientifically based reading research. You'll see journals, you'll see articles, and they have a drop down delta. It's called FAQs. It is facts sheets. It is written in very parent friendly language, and you can see everything from recognizing identifiers for dyslexia, dyslexia and ADD, dyslexia and ADHD, dyslexia and autism. I mean, it covers a variety. They're also available in Spanish. So there's that bilingual component as well. But your first place is to find a trusted resource that's going to provide you that research-based information. Otherwise, like I said, when you venture into the the wide world of the internet, it can be very, very overwhelming. So sticking to that first resource is crucial. The second resource that I recommend is called Reading Rockets, readingrockets.org. Again, it is research-based. It is a warehouse of journals, articles, and again, parent-friendly language. You can see dyslexia characteristic and indicators broken down, disaggregated by grade, by age. So you can kind of hone in on, okay, I have a pre-K 2. I have a first, second, or third grader. What am I supposed to be looking for? What do I need? And then what kind of questions do I need to be asking my classroom teacher?
Okay. And so from those resources, are there any common threads? Like, so if we're looking just to tell people now, are there anything that is unique to a dyslexia diagnosis, or some indicators that parents, because they maybe are stumbling upon this video, they might not be at that research phase, but they're just
Sure.
having a question. What are some common questions that parents have when they are wondering about dyslexia? Like,
Sure.
what
Well, I
is
think
the
right. So I think the first thing is, when do I begin to start to even reach out to my classroom teacher? Because they're going to be your first, they are your first area of research or resource, I could say. So the first thing to notice is, are you seeing a change in your child's attitude from school? Are you, especially this is older school, even in young children, but school age children as well? Are they becoming reluctant or hesitant? Are they pushing back when it comes to homework, and they coming back, with assignments? Um, Understand, kind of to back up, you don't grow out of dyslexia, you grow into dyslexia. So you learn how to manage and modify and live with it, and again, like I said, but you don't grow out of it. So the idea that you can just sort of wait and hope that wait and hope that things kind of get better is not something that I would recommend at all. So you as the parent are you are your child's first and best advocate. You know your child in a way that the classroom teacher simply doesn't. So become the voice and ask the questions first. Is my child reluctant? Are we seeing things that, like, I don't want to go to school, I don't understand, the frustration, the tears, the pushback at home? Are you seeing assignments or materials that are coming home that it just seems consistently too hard for your child? Are there any teacher comments that you're noticing that don't make any sense? Reach out for clarification. For a child to be truly processing or even moving through this continuum of learning, they need to be able to read with about 90% accuracy. So if they're coming home with assignments or with materials that they simply are struggling to even understand, that's a red flag right there. And again, like I said, if the assignments are unclear, if the homework is unclear, if the feedback is unclear, reach out and begin to ask. That's your first thing, is you see, like I said, those home indicators.
Okay. And I know, as far as getting a child tested for
Mhm.
dyslexia, that's not necessarily something that it might be offered by the school. You might get it done by a pediatrician, but I know that there are offers from school districts to test. What are some things that parents should ask when they know that their child should be tested for dyslexia? Should they do that through a school? Should they do that privately? How do you recommend they get someone tested?
That's a great question. So pediatricians do not test for dyslexia because it is an educational diagnosis. You may have a recommendation from a pediatrician that says, I have a concern, but a medical doctor is not going to make that diagnosis. So you have outside testing, and then you have what we would call in-house testing through that K-12 or even a public-private partnership. So if you pursue outside testing, that is basically on your own dime. You're going to be paying for that out of pocket. For those of you enrolled in public school, your first and direct contact is through, again, your classroom teacher. Every district and state by law is required to have something called MTSS, which is it's basically, or the acronyms change again, which is what we face in the military world. It's that Texas doesn't sound like Virginia. The acronyms are going to change in Georgia. What are we looking for?
Yeah.
But basically, you have a tiered intervention process. A child can go through that if a classroom teacher is recognizing it, or you as a parent address that concern. But you as a parent have the right to request the testing. And that school district is authorized to respond. in some way. Now, you can either agree with the response or you can disagree with the response, and that's where it gets kind of dicey, and it can get. But as a parent, you have the right to recommend and request that type of testing.
And when you are, let's say your child's teacher
Mhm.
has recognized and you've recognized that they were
Sure.
struggling, so they're in that intervention.
Mhm.
Do you have any recommendations when you would say, "Hey, let's call this. This intervention isn't
Mhm.
enough. We do need to move to
Okay.
that testing phase," especially for military parents who might be about to move, or do
Right.
you have any recommendations in those periods of uncertainty?
That's a really great question. And here's where it gets kind of murky because it really depends on the child,
Mm,
and it also, here's how I'm not answering your question directly. It can depend on the intervention. It can depend on the length, the frequency, the intensity of the intervention that's even being provided. Is the child responding in, say, a 6 to 9 week manner? But if they're not, well, then do we need to reevaluate? Do we need to go back? Do we need to? A lot of it, when you talk about trusting your gut, this is kind of where that gut feeling can come into play. One thing that I do talk about when I'm moving through the testing process with my parents and my teachers, it's what you need to be doing is establishing very clear and open lines of communication with your classroom teacher, with your building reading specialist or literacy specialist, because what you're doing is you're establishing a team. And that team's focus is on the educational need of the child. So if you as a parent aren't feeling that they're making progress, speak up. You should be having constant contact, progress monitoring, and updates from that classroom teacher and from that reading specialist or whomever is providing that intervention. So that's one thing to be very aware of. The term is progress monitoring.
mm.
Where did they begin? How long are we going to be looking at this? So give me a window, a time-bound window. And how can I manage and measure that steps of progress? Are we seeing that progress? Great. Do we need to continue the intervention? Is it not working? Do we change the intervention or do we need to look for further testing?
Is there anything that you mentioned before that you don't always agree with what the results are? So is that something where you would go and get your own private evaluation? Is that when people often do? Is that they don't agree, or is there um, what happens if you get the results and they're saying nope, they're
Sure.
fine?
Sure. So those results should be provided and clearly explained to you in a committee meeting. It should never be kind of this one-on-one, my child was tested. I was handed a report by some person at the district and they said, no, we don't recognize the characteristics of dyslexia or other related disorders. And then you walk away. It's a committee decision and the parent is a part of that committee. You have the right to object. And articulate your objections. I don't feel comfortable. This doesn't make any sense. Could you explain this assessment to me further? At that point, you kind of, this is where we get into options. And again, by state, it can get a little dicey. But I'm just speaking to my past district where if a child was tested, you have 1 year before the child could be reevaluated with those testing instruments. Now, there are other additional testing instruments that the district can offer, but that's where you're now moving up, as we would say, that chain of command. If we're now leaving the local school district, now we're moving into maybe a district concern where you're not going to be contacting, the literacy department, the dyslexia testing department, if that's available.
Mm.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah,
It's
no,
by state. And this
it
is where it
does.
does get very disconcerting, especially for military families. It's because, well, I'm in Texas, we do it this way. I'm in Virginia, we do it this way. And
So what does that
and where
look
do
like?
I go?
What does
Right.
that
Where do
look
I
like
go?
for families? So like as you are, you're an expert in this area. So as you're working with families who are possibly moving into
Mhm.
either hopefully a more supportive or sometimes
Sure.
less supportive communities for dyslexia, is there any
Mhm.
standards that families should be looking for? So if they're not, if okay, your child has a diagnosis,
Okay.
this is what's offered, but maybe you would recommend a minimum of this. What would your minimum as far as extra support, extra assistance, or is that truly again individualized because of the student?
Well, it actually, I'm glad you brought up that word individualized because that's what the I in IEP stands for. So
Yeah.
it's based on the child's need, because dyslexia is a spectrum, mild, moderate, severe. So you may have a child that needs very intensive support. You may have a child that only needs intermittent support. It depends on meeting the educational need of that child. But however the child's need is articulated in that IEP, it is designed to meet the needs of the child, not the convenience of the district. And I know that can be very
Mhm.
jarring. It can be, that can kind of, cause folks to bristle. But the IEP, the I is individualized, and it is for the child. I'm going to say it again, not the convenience of the district.
Mhm.
So those individual goals that are written, they do need to be time bound. They need to be based on the present level of the child's performance, so you can measure that growth, and we can see, is it sustained growth? Are we plateauing? We can see and truly measure success.
Mhm. And so, you mentioned IEP, which is Individualized Education Program. Other people and our founder will cringe, sometimes refer it to Individualized Education Plan, which is not
Sure,
actually correct, but it is known as that too. And so
sure.
um, that is, in our survey, our annual survey that we conducted, we found a lot
Mhm.
of students who have a diagnosis of dyslexia don't always have an IEP. It's not necessarily something that, certain disabilities have an easier time of getting an individualized
Right.
education program.
Mhm.
Dyslexia, not that was not the findings that we found. So I wonder if you have found similar reports from your families that they don't have.
Abs- yes. And I apologize for correct. Absolutely. So, for example, I'll speak to Texas. Dyslexia can be serviced under a 504 or an IEP. So now we're dealing with kind of this gray area navigating in between special education, if it does imply that's a modification of a curriculum, or a 504, which is accommodation or access to the curriculum. So because dyslexia in Texas can be served under both, now you, as a parent, you really are going to have to trust, and this can get kind of dicey, but trust um, the information that you're receiving, and then kind of know the needs of your child. What sort of intensive support are they going to need? Are they not going to need? What sort of interventions are they going to be receiving? Who's going to be providing those interventions, and where will those interventions be provided? So it's not just the content, but it's also placement. So
Mhm.
I know that doesn't really answer your question, but
No, no, it does.
this is where the confusion kind of it resides, because you're dealing with different state, different state, the language, and even within that state, with district to district. So
Mhm.
it can be very, it is incredibly overwhelming.
It is, and that's what we're trying to do is provide a few resources to families, and especially, our
Right.
military families. We're moving, we're transitioning often.
Mm.
We almost have to be. I say we plan to pivot. We have to
Oh
plan
yeah.
ahead, and so in this case, and as far as being the best advocate and person who knows the most about your own child, what is something parents, kind of a tip or trick that you would recommend doing if things are not necessarily going as well as they wanted a district, or even as you transition? Is there anything that parents can do during transitions to help mitigate some of those struggles, that maybe those gaps I know that the families face? Or is it truly something that, is kind of common and, normal, and they kind of have to just the family rolls with it as usual?
Well, and that's a great question, because like I said, I mean, dyslexia has come so far, just within the last 30 years. So you're seeing now a lot of online technological supports that are available. So there are learning apps that you could even, use to hopefully, mitigate some of that transitional time when you're PCSing in between duty station. You can look at, maybe from your reading specialist or your dyslexia interventionist, they can provide additional support, if it's paper pencil, or the old school, which we do in dyslexia, because it is multi-sensory teaching. Plopping your kid in front of a laptop is not the end all be all.
Mhm.
There has to be it has to be a multi-sensory support. And I tell my parents, you're, as much as you need to become the subject matter expert as much as you can, it is on the district to provide you and to be that subject matter expert for you, and to provide those resources for you as well. Like I said, online support, there are some traditional paper pencil things that you can do, some materials that you can purchase, but a lot of it just kind of comes in that gap, that overlapping gap. But be prepared when you're moving in from one district, excuse me, moving from one district, moving into another. Be prepared to become proactive the minute you set foot on the ground. Do not expect your incoming school district to seek you out. Do not expect that incoming district just to, I've shown up and now I'm just going to sit back and wait for someone to contact me. Absolutely not. This now falls on you to step in and to take charge, and you're have more Army acronyms. You're going to have to run point on this one is all you're going to have to step out and make that phone call to the administrator, to the counselor, to the literacy specialist, whoever it is on your new campus, and say, I'm here. My child is dyslexic. We have a 504. We have an IEP. Who do I need to talk to? Mm-hmm. And be proactive.
Yep. And especially, if that's one of the reasons why, we recommend getting those processes started, like we were saying before, the testing before you move, so that you do have a diagnosis in hand. You may not have necessarily an IEP or a 504. Let's say you don't. Right. At least you have the diagnosis in hand so that you can immediately ask for what, to have a meeting. Yes. and to get something started for you.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And that it could be, and we can talk about school liaison officers. I'll be glad to kind of diverge into that, topic as well. That if it's finding, that like I said, that local resource, who is you're going to run point, and who do I need to speak to initiate this process? Either I'm coming with paperwork, or I'm coming with a very real concern. How do I move forward? Who do I need to speak to? How do we get this process going?
Yeah. And you're obviously school liaison, EFMP office, they often have those points of contact. So if ever you need to elevate something outside of, the first contact you find, they are a great resource. Every location does things a little bit differently. Every service branch does things slightly differently, but at least you have a few starting points in those conversations. Right. And if you have additional, dyslexia specific questions, our community provides resources and can connect you to others who are more subject matter experts in not only dyslexia, but in the military moves and the complications that you might not find in just any old group. Absolutely. So, but yeah, there's a lot.
Absolutely. And having taught for so long, I've taught, public school. I've taught public school on an installation. You get kind of everyone, but in my previous campus, I was a very high military population. Our campus in Virginia was very government related, because it was NOVA, so government related, military related. So a lot of it is having those initial conversations with that parent and being, like I said, you're building that, keeping those open lines of communication. We have orders to Bragg. We have orders to, Irwin. We have orders to pick an installation. And it's almost like making your own education PCS plan. It's setting up, okay, I'm here, but it's time to start researching the schools here, and having those conversations, doing the legwork on that front end, so that when you reach that destination, that, the endpoint on that PCS, you know exactly who to contact, where am I going, who am I talking to, to move that process along.
Yeah. And there's so many different parts of that. We during this series, we met with PCS grades. And so they're giving us the tips and tricks of how to get, make the most and know your rights as far as what do the movers have to do. So there's a lot to think about when you're moving, and your child's education is probably the most, I don't want to say heavy, but it's high stakes. And so we want to make sure we're hitting the ground running when we come into a new district. So those are some really great tips and tricks. Do you have any last minute thoughts or things you would suggest to parents who are maybe early diagnosis, early in this process, things that you've seen find success in families? Any last minute thoughts on that?
Well, I think the first thing is, you are their cheerleader, is to be their cheerleader. You're there to support them. And I would always tell my kids, it's not my kids, my students, that I do get a little misty about it, because this is not only is this professional, but it's very personal for me, that I want my kids to see themselves as lifelong readers. And it's not that you can't, you absolutely can. We're just going to find out what works best for you. So, that very first hurdle of self-confidence and motivating and finding ways for them to access reading where they have a positive relationship is crucial. It is absolutely crucial. I think back to one of my very first students that I had as a dyslexia interventionist, and he in the middle of interventions, and he broke down into tears. And this is an 11-year-old boy crying in front of other children. And I, oh my goodness. And he looked at me and he said, you're the first person that didn't think that I was stupid. And just to have those moments, to have a child see themselves as a reader. So as a parent, our first goal is to be their cheerleader, and you can do this, and to find ways, audiobooks, documentaries, finding other ways to access information so it's not just print-based. How can I do this and encourage lifelong learning? Because once that self-esteem issue starts to set in, it becomes not an insurmountable hurdle, but it is a very real obstacle. And just to be aware of that. So your first job, be their cheerleader, be their champion, and find someone else who's going to champion your child the way that you do.
Yeah, no, and that's
Sorry.
no, it's my daughter has struggled with reading. We just had her recently tested, so she's halfway through the process. So I'm right there alongside families. So if you have a question, I'm doing it in the middle of COVID in California. So message or send an email over to me, and I'll be happy to talk more about it. But finding the subjects that are interesting as well can be really life-changing. My daughter
absolutely
started off with the princess books, and she's like, I don't want that. But we gave her a book about the Titanic sinking, and she's like, that's my thing. I'm a scientist. I want to learn about history. So sometimes it's as simple as switching the subject to something that maybe grandma picked out something and that was great, but it wasn't what made her come alive in reading and making that story come alive for her. So
absolutely,
it's not always that simple, of course, but the love of learning is so important. So thank you so much for sharing, for your expertise. And families, it might be in the beginning of your journey with a new diagnosis, but you are not alone. You have people out there who are working with your students like Laura and others, and our community here is here to support you. If you have any questions, email info@thepromiseact.org, and keep listening and watching for more of our videos on the Trust Your Gut series, so you can kind of dive in, get some tools in your tool belt as you frequently move and are trying to figure out what's going on. Thank you again, Laura, for coming and speaking with us.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me. This has been great. Thank you.